March 17, 1958. The sun had barely crept over the elm-lined streets of Fairfax, Virginia, when Harold Patterson began his daily milk route at 4:30 in the morning. The neighborhood was one of those pristine post-war communities where white picket fences stood as proud sentinels and lawns were manicured with almost military precision. Here, in the shadow of the nation's capital, government employees and military contractors lived side by side, their lives seemingly as orderly and predictable as the bottles of milk Harold delivered each dawn. He knew every house on his route, like the back of his weathered hands, knew which families preferred whole milk and which ordered skim, knew who left notes requesting extra butter, and who sometimes forgot to leave payment for weeks at a time. What Harold Patterson did not know, as he climbed into his refrigerated truck that cool spring morning, was that his attention to the mundane details of suburban life would soon crack open one of the most sensitive Soviet intelligence operations in American history. The pattern he was about to notice would seem so insignificant, so utterly ordinary, that any reasonable person might have dismissed it entirely. But Harold Patterson was not just any milkman, and what he would discover in the coming weeks would prove that sometimes the smallest anomalies reveal the darkest secrets. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Harold Patterson had driven milk trucks for Morrison Dairy for 12 years, ever since he returned from the Pacific Theater in 1946 with a Purple Heart and a quiet determination never to discuss what he had seen at Okinawa. At 42 years old, he had the kind of face that blended into any crowd, with thinning brown hair, unremarkable features, and a slight stoop from years of hefting milk crates. His wife Martha often joked that he could disappear in an empty room, and Harold took no offense because he knew it was true. Invisibility, he had learned during the war, was often its own kind of protection. What Martha did not know was that her husband's seemingly simple job suited him perfectly, precisely because it allowed him to observe without being observed, to notice without being noticed. The Patterson family lived in a modest two-bedroom house in Arlington, close enough to Harold's dairy route that he could be home by noon most days. They had 2 children, Susan, age 10, and Bobby, age 7, and like most families in 1958, they were living the American dream of suburban comfort and Cold War anxiety in equal measure. The television brought news of Sputnik satellites and nuclear tests into their living room each evening, and school children across the nation practiced duck and cover drills with the same regularity they recited the Pledge of Allegiance. Everyone knew someone who worked for the government in some capacity or another. Washington was a company town, and the company was the business of keeping America safe from the Red Menace. The house at 1724 Maple Drive had been on Harold's route for 3 years, ever since the Novaks moved in during the summer of 1955. Charles Novak was a systems analyst for the Department of Defense, a fact he mentioned casually at neighborhood barbecues with the kind of practiced nonchalance that suggested the work was both important and boring in equal measure. His wife Eleanor was a quiet woman with dark hair and a slight accent that she explained came from growing up in a Czech immigrant family in Chicago. They had no children, which seemed slightly unusual in a neighborhood where families with 3 or 4 kids were the norm, but they were pleasant enough neighbors who kept their lawn trimmed and their curtains closed. Harold had delivered milk to the Novak house every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for 3 years without incident or interest. They ordered 2 bottles of whole milk and 1 bottle of cream each delivery, like clockwork. The empties were always left in the insulated box by the side door, rinsed clean, and the payment envelope was always there on the 1st of the month, never late, never short. It was the kind of reliable, unremarkable routine that made Harold's job simple and his mornings peaceful. But something changed in February of 1958. It started small, so small that Harold almost missed it entirely. On a Wednesday morning, February 5th, Harold noticed that the Novak house had an extra bottle of milk sitting on the front porch, unopened and apparently forgotten. This was unusual but not alarming. People sometimes let milk sit if they went out of town, though most called the dairy to suspend delivery. Harold made a mental note and continued his route, thinking nothing more of it. The following Monday, February 10th, Harold arrived at 1724 Maple Drive at his usual time, approximately 5:15 in the morning. The street was dark except for the occasional porch light, and a light frost made the bottles cold to the touch, even through his work gloves. He approached the insulated box by the side door and found something strange. The previous delivery's bottles were still there, unopened, and there were no empties from the week before either. Harold stood there for a moment, his breath making small clouds in the cold air, and felt the first stirring of something that would later become a gnawing curiosity. The Novaks had 5 bottles of milk sitting outside their house, all untouched, all delivered over the course of the past week. Harold knew the protocol. If a customer did not pick up their delivery for more than 3 days, he was supposed to take the bottles back to the dairy to prevent spoilage and inform his supervisor that the delivery should be suspended until the customer contacted them. It was a simple matter of avoiding waste and protecting the dairy's reputation for freshness, but something about the Novak house made him hesitate. The lights were on inside. He could see the warm glow through the curtains in what he knew was the kitchen window. And there in the driveway sat Charles Novak's blue Buick Roadmaster, covered in a light dusting of frost that suggested it had not been driven that morning, but had certainly been driven recently enough that the Novaks were clearly home. Harold delivered the 2 bottles of milk and 1 of cream as scheduled, setting them carefully in the insulated box alongside the 5 untouched bottles from previous deliveries. The collection now totaled 8 bottles, a small dairy farm's worth of product sitting ignored while the homeowners were clearly present. He made a note on his route sheet, marked the Novak's account with a question mark and moved on to the next house on Maple Drive. That night, over meatloaf and mashed potatoes, Harold mentioned the situation to Martha almost as an afterthought. His wife, who had a practical mind for such things, offered the obvious explanation. Perhaps the Novaks had purchased a larger refrigerator and were stocking up. Or maybe they were planning a party and wanted extra milk on hand. Or perhaps Elena Novak had simply forgotten to bring the bottles inside, and the milk was piling up due to nothing more than absent-mindedness. All perfectly reasonable explanations that Harold accepted with a nod while mentally filing away a different thought entirely. People who worked for the Department of Defense in 1958 were trained to be security conscious. Leaving 8 bottles of milk to spoil on one's porch seemed inconsistent with that training, particularly for someone like Charles Novak, who Harold had overheard at the neighborhood 4th of July picnic, discussing the importance of operational security in the modern age. Wednesday, February 12th. Harold arrived at the Novak house at 5:17 in the morning, according to his pocket watch, a reliable timepiece that had survived the war with him. The 8 bottles from Monday were still there, joined now by today's delivery of 2 bottles of milk and 1 of cream. 11 bottles total. The house showed signs of occupancy. The living room curtains were drawn, but a light was visible through a crack. The car was in the driveway. The lawn showed fresh footprints in the frost, suggesting someone had walked to the mailbox recently. Yet the milk remained untouched. Harold stood in the pre-dawn darkness and did something he had never done in 12 years of delivering milk. He walked around to the front of the house and checked the mailbox. It was full, stuffed with what looked like several days' worth of letters and circulars. He quickly returned to his truck, his heart beating faster than he would have liked, and sat behind the wheel for a moment collecting his thoughts. The accumulation of mail alongside the accumulation of milk suggested absence, but the lights and the car suggested presence. It was a contradiction, and Harold Patterson had learned in the war that contradictions were often where danger lived. Over the next 2 weeks, Harold paid closer attention to 1724 Maple Drive than any house on his route deserved. The milk continued to pile up, bottle after bottle, until the insulated box could no longer contain them all, and Harold had to start stacking them carefully on the porch itself. By the end of February, there were 23 bottles of various dairy products arranged in neat rows, like soldiers awaiting orders. The house maintained its signs of occupation. Lights turned on and off at irregular hours. The car moved occasionally, its position in the driveway shifting every few days. But the mailbox continued to overflow, and the milk continued to accumulate, and Harold's curiosity hardened into something closer to concern. On March 3, 1958, Harold made a decision that would change his life and potentially alter the course of Cold War intelligence operations. He drove past the Novak house at 11 o'clock at night, long after his shift had ended, long after any reasonable milkman should be cruising through suburban neighborhoods. He told Martha he was meeting an old army buddy for drinks, which was not entirely a lie since he fully intended to have a drink after what he was about to do. He parked his personal car, a modest Ford Fairlane, 3 houses down from 1724 Maple Drive, and walked back through the shadows, staying close to the hedges and trees that lined the street. The night was cold and clear, the kind of night where sound traveled farther than it should. Harold could hear a dog barking somewhere in the distance, could hear the faint sound of a television playing from a neighboring house. The Novak residence was dark, except for a single light in an upstairs window, what he believed was the master bedroom. He approached the side of the house where the accumulated milk bottles created a small dairy monument, and knelt down in the shadows, ostensibly checking the delivery box, but actually looking for anything unusual. That is when he heard them. Voices, speaking in low tones coming from inside the house. Not English. Harold's grasp of foreign languages was limited to a few phrases of Japanese picked up during the war, but he knew the cadence of Slavic languages when he heard them. His company had had a Polish radio man at Okinawa, and the sound coming through the walls of the Novak house carried that same rhythmic, consonant-heavy quality. He could not make out words, could not understand meaning, but he could distinguish at least 3 different voices, all male, all speaking with intensity and purpose. Harold returned to his car, his mind racing. He sat behind the wheel for several minutes, hands trembling slightly despite the car's heater. The pieces were assembling themselves into a picture he did not particularly want to see. A Defense Department employee with access to classified information, a wife with a suspiciously vague background story about Chicago and Czech parents, an unexplained pattern of ignoring normal household routines while maintaining the appearance of occupancy, foreign voices speaking in the middle of the night in a house that should contain only 2 people, and accumulating milk bottles that suggested either profound absent-mindedness or profound distraction. The next morning, Harold Patterson did something else he had never done in 12 years of milk delivery. He called in sick. Martha was concerned, pressing her palm to his forehead and asking if he had a fever, but Harold assured her he was fine, just tired, just needed a day to rest. What he actually needed was a day to think, to consider his options, to decide whether he was imagining connections that did not exist, or whether he had stumbled onto something genuine and dangerous. Harold spent that morning in the Arlington Public Library, reading recent newspapers and trying to quiet the voice in his head that kept insisting he was being paranoid. The papers were full of Cold War tensions. The Soviets had launched another satellite. Congress was debating fallout shelter funding. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had given a speech warning about Soviet infiltration of American institutions. Harold read about the Rosenberg case, about Julius and Ethel who had been executed just 5 years earlier for passing atomic secrets to Moscow. He read about Elizabeth Bentley, the former Soviet courier, who had exposed dozens of spies operating in America. He read about the Venona project, though the details were vague and heavily classified, which had revealed the extent of Soviet espionage during the war years. The world described in these newspapers was one of shadows and suspicion, where neighbors might be enemies and trust was a dangerous luxury. Harold sat at a library table, surrounded by newspapers and his own spiraling thoughts, and came to a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. If he was wrong, he would embarrass himself and waste the time of federal agents. But if he was right and said nothing, he would be complicit in whatever harm might result from his silence. That afternoon, March 4, 1958, Harold Patterson walked into the Washington field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and asked to speak with someone about a possible security matter. The receptionist, a stern woman with gray hair and the expression of someone who had heard every story imaginable, told him to take a seat and wait. He waited for an hour and 47 minutes by his pocket watch, sitting in a hard wooden chair and second-guessing everything he thought he knew. The agent who finally called him back was named Douglas Reeves, a tall man in his early 30s with the kind of haircut and suit that suggested he took his work very seriously. Reeves led Harold into a small interview room with pale green walls and a single table with 2 chairs. He offered Harold coffee, which Harold declined despite wanting it desperately, and asked him to explain why he was there. Harold told him about the milk bottles. He told him about the Novaks. He told him about the voices speaking in a foreign language, and as he spoke, he watched Agent Reeves's expression shift from polite attention to genuine interest to something approaching concern. Reeves asked questions, specific questions about times and dates, and exactly what Harold had seen and heard. He asked about the Novaks' daily routines, about their car's movements, about whether Harold had observed any visitors to the house. He asked if Harold had mentioned his concerns to anyone else, and Harold admitted he had told his wife he was worried about a customer, but had not provided details. Agent Reeves excused himself for several minutes, leaving Harold alone in the small room with his mounting anxiety. When the agent returned, he was accompanied by an older man who introduced himself simply as Mr. Caldwell. This second man had grey hair and the weathered look of someone who had spent decades doing difficult work. He shook Harold's hand with a firm grip and thanked him for coming forward. What happened next was simultaneously mundane and extraordinary. Mr. Caldwell explained in careful language that revealed nothing while confirming everything, that the FBI took such matters seriously. He asked Harold if he would be willing to continue his normal milk delivery routine, and to document anything unusual he observed at 1724 Maple Drive. He emphasized that Harold should not deviate from his normal schedule or behavior in any way. He should not attempt to investigate further on his own. He should simply be the milkman he had always been, but with more careful attention to detail. Mr. Caldwell also explained that Harold could not discuss this with anyone, including his wife. National security matters required absolute discretion. If Harold was uncomfortable with that, he could walk out now with the FBI's thanks and nothing more would come of it. But if he chose to help, he needed to understand the seriousness of what he was undertaking. Harold thought about Martha and the kids. He thought about the house he had crawled through on Okinawa, while Japanese machine guns carved up the air around him. He thought about the men he had lost, and the price they had paid for a country that sometimes forgot their sacrifice. And he told Mr. Caldwell he would help. The FBI provided Harold with a contact protocol. He was to call a specific phone number if he observed anything urgent. Otherwise, he would meet with Agent Reeves every Saturday morning at a diner in Alexandria, where Harold would provide his observations from the previous week, under the guise of having breakfast with an old friend. The Bureau would handle the rest. Harold left the FBI office that afternoon, feeling like he had stepped through a door into a different life, one where his simple milk route had become something covert and consequential. For the next month, Harold Patterson became the FBI's eyes on Maple Drive. He delivered milk to the Novak house 3 times per week, watching as the bottle count continued to climb into the dozens. He noted that the car moved more frequently now, often disappearing for hours at a time, and returning in the middle of the night. He observed that the house received visitors, always men, always arriving after dark in different vehicles. On March 16th, he saw a man leaving the Novak residence at 4:45 in the morning, just before Harold arrived for his delivery. The man was carrying a briefcase and walked with the purposeful stride of someone on a schedule. Harold memorized the man's appearance: approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall, dark hair, wearing a grey overcoat and fedora, late 30s or early 40s. At his Saturday meeting with Agent Reeves, Harold provided this description along with his other observations. Reeves listened carefully, taking notes in a small leather notebook, and thanked Harold for his diligence. He mentioned, almost casually, that the Bureau was now conducting its own investigation into the Novaks, and that Harold's observations had been extremely valuable. He did not provide details, and Harold did not ask for them. He had learned in the war that information was compartmentalized for good reason. What Harold did not know, because Mr. Caldwell and Agent Reeves had not told him, was that his report about the milk bottles had triggered an intensive counterintelligence operation involving multiple federal agencies. The FBI had been monitoring Charles Novak peripherally for several months as part of a broader investigation into potential security breaches at the Department of Defense, but they had lacked sufficient evidence to justify more aggressive surveillance. Harold's observations provided that justification. The Bureau had installed telephone taps on the Novak residence within 48 hours of Harold's initial report. They had placed the house under constant visual surveillance, rotating teams of agents through the neighborhood disguised as utility workers, delivery men, and ordinary residents. They had examined Charles Novak's work history in minute detail, discovering irregularities in his background check that had been overlooked during his initial security clearance process. Elena Novak's supposedly straightforward immigrant family story began to unravel under scrutiny, revealing a more complex and suspicious history involving relatives who had remained in Soviet-controlled Czechoslovakia after the war. By late March of 1958, the FBI had assembled enough evidence to bring the case to the attention of the Central Intelligence Agency and the Department of Defense's Security Office. What they discovered was more significant than anyone had initially suspected. Charles and Elena Novak were not merely communist sympathizers or careless security risks. They were active intelligence operatives working for the Soviet Union, part of a network that had been penetrating American defense installations for years. The voices Harold had heard speaking in a foreign language were not Czech, as he had suspected, but Russian. The men visiting the house in the middle of the night were not friends or relatives, but handlers and fellow operatives. The briefcase the man had been carrying contained photographed documents from Charles Novak's office, classified materials related to missile defense systems that were being copied and transmitted to Moscow through a complex series of dead drops and coded communications. The accumulated milk bottles, the detail that had started Harold Patterson's investigation, turned out to be the result of operational security protocols gone wrong. The Novaks had been instructed by their handlers to maintain absolute normalcy in their daily routines, to avoid drawing attention to their activities. But the intensity of their intelligence work that February and March had consumed so much of their time and attention that mundane household tasks like bringing in the milk had been neglected. The irony was not lost on the FBI agents working the case. The very attempts to maintain normalcy had created the abnormality that exposed the operation. On April 9, 1958, at precisely 6:30 in the morning, FBI agents arrested Charles and Elena Novak at their home on Maple Drive. They also simultaneously arrested 4 other individuals at locations across the Washington metropolitan area, rolling up an entire Soviet intelligence network in a coordinated operation. The arrests were conducted quietly, without media fanfare or public announcement, because the FBI wanted to exploit the captured intelligence and turn as many of the operatives as possible before Moscow realized the network had been compromised. Harold Patterson learned about the arrests not from the FBI, but from the obvious presence of federal agents at 1724 Maple Drive that morning. He had arrived for his regular milk delivery to find the street blocked by unmarked cars and men in suits going in and out of the house. Agent Reeves appeared at Harold's truck window and told him simply that his assistance was no longer needed and that he should return to his normal route. The milk delivery to 1724 Maple Drive was to be suspended indefinitely. Harold never saw the inside of the Novak house. He never learned the full extent of what had been happening there, and he never received any public recognition for his role in uncovering the operation. What Harold did receive, several weeks later, was a visit from Mr. Caldwell. The older FBI man appeared at Harold's front door on a Sunday afternoon, wearing civilian clothes and carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. Martha answered the door and called Harold, who invited Caldwell inside with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. They sat in the Patterson living room, with its modest furniture and family photographs on the mantel, and Caldwell thanked Harold again for his service to his country. The package contained a letter, typed on FBI stationery, commending Harold Patterson for his exceptional observation skills and his contribution to national security. The letter was signed by someone whose name meant nothing to Harold, but whose title, Assistant Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, suggested significance. Caldwell explained that the letter would be placed in a classified file and would never be made public during Harold's lifetime. The case against the Novaks and their associates was being handled with maximum secrecy to protect ongoing counterintelligence operations. Harold would never be called to testify, would never be named in any official record, and would never be able to tell anyone, including his wife, the full story of what he had done. Caldwell also explained in vague terms that honored the classification requirements that the intelligence secured through the arrest of the Novak network had significant value. Moscow had been receiving detailed information about American missile defense systems, information that could have compromised national security for years to come. By rolling up the network when they did, the United States had not only stopped the leakage, but had also gained insights into Soviet intelligence collection priorities and methods. The milk bottles, those mundane glass containers that Harold had noticed accumulating day after day, had been the thread that unraveled a major espionage operation. Before he left, Caldwell told Harold something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He said that intelligence work was often portrayed as glamorous, full of exotic locations and dramatic confrontations, but the reality was different. Real intelligence work was about paying attention to details that everyone else missed, about noticing patterns that seemed insignificant until you understood their context, about ordinary people doing their jobs with extraordinary care. Harold Patterson, Milkman, had demonstrated those qualities. His country was grateful, even if that gratitude had to remain secret. After Caldwell left, Harold sat in his living room and held the letter, reading it several times. Martha came in and asked who the visitor had been, and Harold told her it was someone from the dairy company, thanking him for his years of service. It was not entirely a lie, he reasoned, though it was certainly not the full truth. He put the letter in the back of his dresser drawer, buried under socks and undershirts, where it would remain for decades. The Novak case never became public knowledge in the way some spy cases did. There were no dramatic trials, no newspaper headlines, no television interviews. Charles and Elena Novak were quietly convicted in a closed proceeding and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. Several of their co-conspirators were turned and agreed to work for American intelligence as double agents, feeding disinformation back to Moscow. The operation was considered such a success that details remained classified for nearly 30 years, long after Harold Patterson had retired from the dairy business. Harold continued delivering milk for another 15 years, finally retiring in 1973 at the age of 57. He never spoke about the Novak case, not even to Martha, though he sometimes thought about it during his early morning drives through sleeping neighborhoods. He wondered what had happened to the people involved, whether Charles Novak had really believed in the communist cause or had been motivated by money or coercion. He wondered if Elena had known from the beginning what her life would become, or if she had been drawn into espionage gradually. One small compromise leading to another, until there was no turning back. He wondered about the other members of the network, the ones who had been arrested in that coordinated sweep, what their stories might be if they could ever be told. But mostly, Harold thought about the milk bottles. It seemed almost absurd that something so ordinary, so mundane, could have been the key to exposing a sophisticated intelligence operation. In all the spy novels and movies, secrets were uncovered through daring raids and brilliant deductions. In reality, at least in this case, it had been a matter of a milkman noticing that his customers were not drinking their milk. It was a lesson, Harold realized, about the nature of security and the importance of maintaining the small details even when engaged in large conspiracies. The Novaks had been so focused on the complex tradecraft of espionage, the secret meetings and coded communications and photographed documents, that they had forgotten the simple act of bringing in the milk bottles, and that oversight had cost them everything. The irony was delicious, if Harold allowed himself dark humor. The Soviets had spent years building this network, recruiting and training operatives, establishing cover stories and communication protocols, creating an elaborate infrastructure for stealing American secrets. And it had been undone by accumulated dairy products, by the routine observations of a middle-aged man whose job was to deliver milk before most people woke up. There was something fundamentally American about that, Harold thought. Not the heroic frontiersman or the rugged individualist of mythology, but the ordinary citizen doing an ordinary job with attention to detail and a sense that something did not quite fit. In 1983, nearly 25 years after the events on Maple Drive, Harold suffered a heart attack while working in his garden. He survived, though the doctors told him he needed to slow down and avoid stress. Martha, who had been his wife for 39 years by then, took charge of his recovery with the same practical efficiency she had always brought to their life together. Their children, now grown with families of their own, visited regularly and worried in the way adult children worry about aging parents. It was during this recovery period, lying in a hospital bed with time to think, that Harold decided to write down the story of the Novak case. He did not know if anyone would ever read it, did not know if it would remain classified forever, or if someday the details might be released. But he felt compelled to record what had happened, if only for his own understanding. He wrote it in longhand on a yellow legal pad, filling page after page with his neat, careful script. He wrote about the milk bottles and the voices in the night and the meetings with Agent Reeves. He wrote about the mixture of fear and pride he had felt, being part of something larger than himself, while being forbidden from acknowledging it. When he finished, he sealed the pages in an envelope and wrote Martha's name on the outside, with instructions that it should be opened only after his death. He placed the envelope with his will and other important papers, and he told Martha it was there without telling her what it contained. She asked if it was important, and he said it was, but that it was not something that needed to be dealt with immediately. She accepted this, as she had accepted so many things over the years, and they spoke no more about it. Harold Patterson died in November of 1994, at the age of 78. The cause was complications from pneumonia, and the end came more quickly than anyone expected. Martha was with him in the hospital room holding his hand when he slipped away quietly in the early morning hours. It was, several people noted at his funeral, an appropriate time for a milkman to depart. In the darkness before dawn, when the streets are empty and the world has not yet stirred to life. After the funeral, Martha discovered the sealed envelope among Harold's papers. She opened it with trembling hands, not knowing what to expect, and read the account her husband had written. The story of the milk bottles and the Soviet spies, the secret meetings with the FBI, the arrest of the Novaks and the letter of commendation that was still buried in Harold's dresser drawer. Martha read it all, tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the realization that her husband had carried this secret for nearly 4 decades. She felt pride and sorrow in equal measure. Pride that Harold had served his country in this quiet way, and sorrow that he had been unable to share it with her. Martha contacted the FBI to inquire about the case, wanting to know if the story could now be told. She was connected, after several transfers, to an agent in the counterintelligence division who listened to her summary of Harold's account and asked her to mail copies of the documents. She did so, and several weeks later received a phone call informing her that the Novak case had indeed occurred, as Harold described it, and that while much of the material remained classified, certain details could now be acknowledged. The agent explained that Harold Patterson's contribution had been significant and genuine, and that his discretion over the years had been appreciated. The story became public, in a limited way, in 1995 when the FBI declassified a small portion of the Novak case files. Several newspapers ran articles about the espionage network and its disruption, though most focused on the activities of the spies themselves rather than on how they had been discovered. A few articles mentioned, in passing, that the investigation had been triggered by the observations of a civilian informant, but Harold Patterson's name was not used. Even in death, his role remained largely anonymous, but those who knew the story, the FBI agents who had worked the case, and the handful of other individuals who had been read into the operation over the years, they knew what Harold Patterson had done. They knew that a milkman with no training in counterintelligence, no background in espionage, and no particular reason to care beyond his own sense of duty, had noticed something wrong and had done something about it. They knew that his observations had been the foundation upon which a major counterintelligence success was built. And they knew that his story was a reminder of something important about how security actually works in a free society. The house at 1724 Maple Drive changed hands several times over the years. The couple who bought it from the government after the Novak's conviction knew nothing of the property's history. Neither did the family who purchased it from them in the 70s, or the young professionals who bought it in the 80s. The house became just another home in a neighborhood full of homes, indistinguishable from its neighbors, its secrets buried under layers of new paint and updated landscaping. Harold's old milk route was eventually discontinued when Morrison Dairy consolidated its operations in the 1970s. Home milk delivery was becoming a thing of the past, replaced by supermarkets and convenience stores. The insulated delivery boxes that had once stood sentinel by side doors throughout the neighborhood were gradually removed or repurposed as planters and storage containers. The morning ritual of glass bottles clinking in wire carriers, the distinctive sound that had been the soundtrack of Harold's working life, faded from the American soundscape. But the lesson of the Novak case remained relevant. In the decades that followed, as espionage became increasingly technological and sophisticated, intelligence professionals still emphasized the importance of noticing anomalies. Training programs at the CIA and FBI used variations of Harold Patterson's story, often without naming him, to illustrate the principle that human observation remained a critical component of counterintelligence. Computers and satellites could collect vast amounts of information, but it still took a human being to notice that something was wrong, that a pattern did not fit, that the milk bottles were accumulating when they should not be. The Cold War that had defined Harold Patterson's adult life ended in 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The existential threat that had justified so much secrecy and sacrifice, so much fear and vigilance receded into history. New threats emerged to take its place, as threats always do, but the immediate danger of nuclear annihilation by a communist superpower became a memory rather than a daily anxiety. The neighborhoods where government workers and military contractors had once looked at their neighbors with suspicion, wondering who might be passing secrets to Moscow, gradually relaxed into something approaching normalcy. Yet the story of how Harold Patterson noticed the milk bottles and helped expose a Soviet spy network retained its power as a teaching tool and as a reminder of ordinary heroism. It was not a story of dramatic confrontations or daring rescues. It was a story of paying attention, of caring enough to notice when something was wrong, of having the courage to report concerns even when doing so seemed awkward or potentially foolish. It was a story about the kind of citizenship that democracies require but often take for granted, the willingness of ordinary people to take responsibility for the security of their community and their country. Harold Patterson never thought of himself as a hero. He was uncomfortable with the idea, would have rejected it immediately if anyone had suggested it to his face. He had simply done what seemed necessary at the time, had noticed something odd and reported it to the appropriate authorities. That he had been right, that his observations had led to significant consequences, was almost beside the point in his mind. He had done his job, first as a soldier and later as a milkman, with the same quiet attention to detail and sense of duty. That this had occasionally resulted in historically significant outcomes was merely incidental to the larger project of living a decent life and taking care of his responsibilities. Martha Patterson lived for another 12 years after Harold's death, passing away peacefully in her sleep in 2006 at the age of 87. Before she died, she established a small scholarship fund at the local community college in Harold's name, designated for students studying criminal justice or national security studies. The scholarship application required no essay, no elaborate explanation of career goals or personal achievements. It required only a brief statement from the applicant's employer or supervisor attesting to the student's attention to detail and reliability in their work. It was Martha's way of honoring what she had learned about her husband after his death, his belief that diligence in ordinary tasks was the foundation of extraordinary outcomes. The first recipient of the Harold Patterson Scholarship was a young woman working her way through college as a night security guard at an office building. Her supervisor noted in his letter that she had once discovered an attempted burglary, not through any dramatic confrontation, but through noticing that a door that should have been locked was slightly ajar. It was exactly the kind of observation, the kind of attention to detail, that Harold would have recognized and appreciated. Martha attended the scholarship award ceremony and shook the young woman's hand, thinking about milk bottles and Soviet spies and the long chain of consequences that could flow from simply paying attention. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.